This talk is called Fight, Flight, or Freeze, Releasing Organizational Trauma. And sometimes I feel like the title of this talk is longer than the actual talk itself. So one thing I'm going to start working on next year is maybe having more succinct titles for my talks, but that's all right. So anyway, very quick introduction about myself, because you're not really here to hear about me. You're here to hear about things we can do to make our organizations better. But just a little bit of background. So my name is Matty Stratton. This is me on Twitter, engage with my brand. I podcast at Arrested DevOps. If you're a podcasting kind of person, you want to learn about the DevOps, so check us out. I work for a company called PagerDuty. This is our mascot, Pagey. How many people have heard of PagerDuty? Okay, cool, great. Now I've talked about PagerDuty. So now I'm done with that part. I'm not going to be talking about our product today, but I will give some examples of how we do work at PagerDuty, where that might come up. And then really ultimately, the whole point of a resume slide like this is to provide validation as to why you should listen to me. And basically this is why, because apparently I have the best hair out of any developer advocate. So, so let's get right into this here. So the first thing is just, for warning, there's a discussion of trauma and post-traumatic stress in this. I'm not going to talk about specific personal trauma, but I always like to make sure that that's clear. Disclaimer, the second, while I am a trauma survivor, I am not a mental health professional. So none of this is mental health, personal mental health advice. So we got that out of the way. Let's talk about zebras. So imagine a zebra. It's easy to imagine because there's a picture of one. So a zebra that's at rest with no threat of predators is operating within what's called the rest and digest function of the parasympathetic nervous system. He's just chilling out there, being a chill zebra, maybe eating some grass out on the savannah, thinking about making little baby zebras. Everything's cool and it's fine. Then along comes a lion. The lion starts chasing the zebra. So when this happens, drastic physiological changes happen with the activation of what's called the fight or flight response of the sympathetic nervous system. So the zebra's heart rate increases, the breathing increases, large amounts of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline are released into the bloodstream, pupils dilate, the blood pressure increases, and any non-essential functions like digestion stop. The zebra's nervous system is preparing for it to literally run for its life. Now, if the zebra is caught, its nervous system is overwhelmed and it's got no further solution. So what does it do? It plays dead, it freezes. This is called the freeze response. Now, the lion may then drop the zebra. It's like, okay, I caught this one, I'm gonna go catch another one. So the zebra might get away. So if the lion leaves and the zebra is able to escape, does anybody know what a zebra does in this case? It's okay if you don't. It shakes. It literally shakes it off. And it returns its nervous system back to a resting state, back to rest and digest. So a traumatic thing happens to the zebra, it's able to release it and move on and become a chill zebra. Now, I'm about to tell you something here. So there's a lot of really great learning that you're going to have here at DevOps Enterprise Summit over these days. But if there's one thing that is probably the most important thing you're going to learn over these 3 days, it's this next bit, so be ready. Humans are not zebras. So if you learn nothing else, know this. What do I mean by this? So the autonomic nervous system is common to all mammals. That's the fight or flight response. But humans have this thing called a prefrontal cortex. Zebras and lesser mammals don't have that. And usually the prefrontal cortex is an advantage. Right? This is where executive function happens. This is how we are able to identify the difference between good and bad, same and different, understanding consequences. This is all because we have a prefrontal cortex. The problem is, this is also where we mentally replay traumatic scenarios. And this activates our sympathetic nervous system exactly like the real threat would. That's the difference between humans and other mammals, right? Is that the perception of trauma will have the same physiological response because of our prefrontal cortex. So I didn't make up the zebra metaphor myself. This comes from someone named Dr. Peter Levine, who's done a lot of work on post-traumatic stress. And so Dr. Levine says, if you think about this, animals in the wild, they are not traumatized by routine threats to their lives, right? They get attacked by a lion, they move on, they go back to being a chill zebra. Humans, on the other hand, we are readily overwhelmed, and we're subject to traumatic symptoms of hyperarousal, shutdown, and dysregulation. We don't always know how to get back to being a chill zebra. So this is something called the window of tolerance. And when we think about in a healthy nervous system, something will happen, right? So we aren't always perfectly always in the middle, right? So we're thinking about the case of the chill zebra, right? So arousal activation, something happens, activates a sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight, like we talked about. And then when we're done, we kind of come back down into parasympathetic, we settle, and we kind of move through these waves. And this is operating within a range called the window of tolerance. And the window of tolerance is a zone of emotional arousal that's optimal for well-being and effective functioning. This is okay. This is how we normally operate. Things happen, we move on. Now, and the parasympathetic, again, is rest and digest. It's a conservation of energy. Sympathetic is the fight or flight response. When trauma is introduced, though, when we have undischarged traumatic stress, what happens is instead of just having activation and then moving up and moving down, you can see how in the red line, we're either becoming very dysregulated and spiky up and down and up and down. And this looks like kind of a crazy Nagios graph, right? Or you can also get stuck on or stuck off, right? And so symptoms of being stuck on are where we have anxiety or panic or hyperactivity, hypervigilance, digestive problems can happen because again, there's physiological responses. Symptoms of being stuck off is depression and lethargy. Also, digestive problems, because again, all these things are connected, right? So again, when this traumatic thing happens, it's undischarged, we either fluctuate back and forth very erratically, or we get stuck on, or we get stuck off. Here's the thing, trauma is not simple, right? It's very nuanced. There's a lot to it. And this is something just in general, by the way, nuance is a thing that we as humans have a big problem with. We have a hard time understanding. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more shortly. So things to keep in mind. What happens is when trauma is when the nervous system has become overwhelmed. Your solution, the active response to the threat does not work, right? That's what introduces trauma. And nervous system activation is the same for real and imagined threats. So whether it's actually happening or it's the memory or the perception of it, your nervous system will react physiologically the exact same way. And this is really, really key. It is subjective and relative, right? So what I perceive as overwhelming or my capacity for a solution might be different than what you perceive as overwhelming. So when I was in treatment for post-traumatic stress, there were people that I was in treatment with who had some very severe PTS. And their experiences, I looked at what they had experienced, and I was like, wow, you have been through so much more than, well, how are we even in the same group? I feel not invalidated, but I don't even belong here. My problems are nothing. But it's nuance, and it's all different. And this is a thing that's really important when we're thinking about how we communicate with others when we understand trauma. So the other thing to bear in mind is, again, trauma is not a zero-sum game, right? So my traumatic experiences do not take away from yours. I'm not invalidating a bad thing that happened to you by talking about a bad thing that happened to me. So we have to remember that they're nuanced. Why does this matter to organizations? Well, one thing that's really important, one of the great things about DOES, right, is you hear from all these different companies, and they're all different than you, right? So their stories they can be helpful, but there's no one particular answer to this. So understand how your organization responds is going to be different than another one, and that's okay. So again, how does this apply to an organization? You're like, okay, great. So we learned about zebras and prefrontal cortexes and activation and windows of tolerance and all this nonsense. That's great. I don't know, Matty, if you heard or not, but this is called the DevOps Enterprise Summit. So how does this apply to an organization or a company? Let's go back and look at the window of tolerance again. Now, what I want you to imagine is, think about this as your company, right? So things happen and you respond to them, and then you go back to business as usual and you respond. But a traumatic event for a lot of organizations is an incident or an outage, right? A severe incident, a severe outage can actually trigger the same way that trauma might trigger an individual, can actually cause undischarged traumatic stress to the organization. And I'm not just talking about the actual trauma that it might cause to the individuals. That's a whole other thing. But bear with me, we're going for a metaphor here, right? So your organization's like a person. So an incident or an outage can be undischarged traumatic stress. And then your organization can either, again, do this flip-flop, flip-flop, or you can get stuck on, you can get stuck off. What do these things look like? So being stuck on is hyperarousal. This is fight or flight, right? So an organization that is stuck on, that is hyper-aroused, display efforts or effects of constant vigilance. It sounds like they're fighting Voldemort, right? They're hyper aware of threats. And it doesn't, by no means am I saying don't be concerned about threats. They happen. But organizations that are hyper aware is they are expecting this to happen all the time, and it is their first and foremost only concern. And what happens in this case is it takes energy away from moving forward. They're stuck on, right? It's like anxiety all the time as the organism of the organization. How can you see that this is happening? This is reflected in how leadership approaches outages and issues. You see a lot of wartime metaphors in organizations like this. You also will sometimes, a symptom of this is production support teams, where you have a whole team whose only job is fixing issues, which we're all DevOps friends here. We kind of know why that might be a problem. I thought, you own it, but you run into these sort of scenarios like this, and what happens in an organization that's stuck on is, again, they don't move forward because they're concerned about, they're putting all their energy into playing defense all the time. Now you can get stuck off, which is hypoarousal. And the outcome is very similar, which is still not innovating. But this is an organization that is stuck off and they don't make any changes. And that's a broad stroke I'm making there, right? So it's usually not as simple as that. But how many people here come from like a more ops background than a software engineering background? Okay. So what makes things break? Changing stuff, right? So that's the metaphor, right? That's sort of the thought that we have. We're like, well, we can't change anything. And one of the ways, I have an organization that I used to work with. I had a friend who was the tech ops director for an e-commerce site that was a sister site that I worked with. And it was a great example of, based on the incentives to her team and to her, reflected that the organization was stuck off. So her bonus was a multiplier of the uptime of their website. How many changes do you think she ever wanted to go? Right? I mean, this is literal money out of her pocket. So these things can happen. And again, this is all nuance, right? Like I'm painting big, broad strokes here, but I want you to start thinking about smaller symptoms that might cause or might indicate these things. And we want to talk about inappropriate response. And what that means is, remember we talked about this prefrontal cortex, and one of its advantages is it helps us with pattern recognition. Well, as humans, we like pattern recognition. It makes us happy. However, systems are complex. There's not always an easy answer. So what we see a lot is we'll see symptoms that seem like something that happened before. We look for this pattern recognition because the signals look like this thing that happened before. But complexity makes that response inappropriate. And back in the olden days of 20 years ago, when I was hiring for tech ops, I used to say that the best system administrators were ones who would sit there, stroke their chin and say, I've seen this before. It's not so good anymore because we go down that road, we're going to keep looking for the same stuff. So this is a little bit more of a, how many people got on an airplane to come here? Okay. How many of you had to take off your shoes? Right? So I know this is all different depending on what country and everything like that. But so this is a little bit of kind of the US metaphor of this. But this is what happened, right? So in December 22nd of 2001, this guy named Richard Reed, he tried to ignite explosives hidden in his shoes when he's flying from Paris to Miami. So in the US, the TSA began randomly searching people's shoes. And then in 2006, they said that all passengers have to remove your shoes. And if you don't know this in the US, now you can actually pay money and not have to take your shoes off anymore. So that's a whole other question. But what's happening here is this was, again, looking for, we're like, well, the pattern is people who wear shoes try to blow up airplanes. And that's being a little glib with that. But here's maybe a better example. So Jennifer Brea says, there's a saying in medicine that when you hear hoofbeats, the first thing that should come to mind is horses, not a zebra. And then she says that too cute by half phrase has killed many zebras. And what this means is we have to stop jumping on that first root cause. Because the first thing that it sounds like, we're going to say, oh, it must be that. But we have complex systems. Also, look at zebras again. So what can we do to understand the window of tolerance that we have as an organization? How can we identify when we're dysregulated? Those are the things I want you to walk away from here and think about. What are some indicators from how your organization responds to incidents and outages and change? Are you able to stay within a window of tolerance, or do you become dysregulated? So those are questions I don't have an answer for you to tell you if you are or you aren't, because the way that you respond is different because it's nuanced. But I'm going to tell you some things you can do to help once you know you are dysregulated. And chances are you probably are, because most of us are. So you can't be a big DevOps thought leader unless you write a letter. So we kind of talked about what Dr. Peter Levine said, and then here's another way to think about it. So resilient organizations are not traumatized by routine threats to their mission or business, right? But non-resilient organizations are readily overwhelmed by these routine threats. They're subject to symptoms of overreaction, shutdown, and lack of regulated effort. And this wasn't said by Dr. Peter Levine, that was actually said by me, and I'm not a doctor. But it's taking that same metaphor, right? So we talk about how zebras are not overwhelmed by trauma, but humans are. If your organization is resilient, these things happen. So one thing to bear in mind, can we prevent all incidents? No. Should we even try? No, because you know what? Incidents are a gift. Incidents are a way that our system is telling us something we didn't already know. Am I trying to say, like, don't try to have resilient systems and it's great if everything breaks all the time? No. But understand that they are a learning opportunity. And if we're trying to prevent them from happening all the time, we're kind of chasing down the wrong thing. We have to be resilient and respond to them. So how do humans and organizations take a deregulated state and become regulated? What's the actionable stuff that we can do? Now, one of the treatments for post-traumatic stress is something called eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And from now on, I'm going to call it EMDR because that's way too long. And in this case, patients' difficult memories are offset with a positive association that's reinforced through external stimuli. So what happens is you kind of you're going through these memories and you're associating them. You're being walked through a thing that associates with a safe space, and then they activate both sides of your brain through lights or clickers to kind of reinforce it. But the important thing to think about here is, remember, we're taking, we want to create a physiological association with that difficult memory is what happens in EMDR. Well, how can we do that for a company? I mean, we're not going to put little blinking lights and little tappers in all of our people's hands and walk through that. But what are some of the things we can do to achieve a similar result? So one thing is working through game days. We want to make an association with outages and issues with a safe place. So game days can really help do this, but they have to be done properly. So game day is kind of an example where you're saying, okay, we're going to introduce some type of exercise that's a false incident, right? We're going to, basically, you're practicing incident response. But the trick of doing them is to keep them low stress and safe. The idea is not to practice under pressure, but to associate response with a safe environment. So I've seen organizations do game days where they're trying to trick their responders. It's not about practicing troubleshooting. It's not about getting used to, trust me, you're going to get plenty of practice of a stressful situation. We're actually trying to do the opposite. We're trying to create an association of the mechanics of incident response with calm response that's happening in a safe and regulated way. And you need to have guidance when you're doing that, so someone has to run it. It's kind of like meditation. With some kinds of trauma, meditation is really helpful. But the problem is, if it's not guided, people can go into their inner landscape, and if they're not prepared, they're going to encounter their trauma and they won't know what to do. So this is also why, so your game days have to have rules and guidance, and you have to have someone that's running it so that you're keeping it safe, because you don't, again, the idea is not to stress people out. And also, you don't want to make it So safe that it's not like a real incident. You still want to follow your process. This kind of taking this to the next level is when we think about things like planned failure injection or chaos engineering. So if you do planned failure injection in a game day, run it like a real incident. So at PagerDuty, we have something called Failure Fridays, right? So, which we actually don't always do on Fridays anymore, but we did for a while and we like the name, so we still call them Failure Fridays. And it's planned failure injection. We introduce failure into the system and to test the resiliency of the system, but what we're doing is we run it like a real incident. Even if we hopefully didn't actually cause an incident, but we have our incident commander that's running the activity. We're going through the whole motions of doing this, right? This creates an organizational association of a safe place for incidents because we do them on Fridays during business hours. Now, the reason we do that is twofold. Number one, we're PagerDuty. We don't have a maintenance window. There's no good time for us to be down. So actually the best time if we're going to introduce failure is the time when most of our engineers are already working anyway, right? But secondly, it's a low stress thing. It's like, hey, it's the middle of the day on Friday. We're just hanging out. We're going to spend an hour and run Failure Friday so that we're just used to that process so that when it does happen at 2 in the morning, our incident commanders and our incident responders are just associated. It's just a thing we do. This is also why you should run all incidents at their initial severity. So I have a saying I like to say in incident response, which is during an incident, don't litigate severity, right? Don't have a big argument about is this a sub 1, is this a sub 2, or whatever. Because maybe this happens, right, with an incident, like you'll get alerted, oh, we have an incident, and then maybe shortly after you start working, you're like, oh, actually nothing was wrong after all. So at PagerDuty, we still run it all the way through. We do a postmortem and we do everything. And the reason is because it gives us more practice. Like we want this to be this thing where we're just used to responding to incidents so that it's just business as usual so it doesn't create extra stress. And you need to be able to process failure. So blamelessness and blameless postmortems or post-incident reviews are just the beginning. It's not enough just to be blameless or blame aware. We have to process the failure or the outage through all the information that we have. And more importantly, it has to have a conclusion, right? We have to tell it as a story. And the story has to have an end. Otherwise, it's just more unprocessed trauma for our organization. So there's this misconception that to process trauma, you just have to get it all out. But really what you have to do is process it. We have to integrate your experience into the coherent whole, which includes telling stories as well as making associations with our autonomic nervous system. What this means in postmortems or an organization is it has to do with how we learn to respond to outages by sharing. So a fellow named J. Paul Reed did his dissertation on technology postmortems. And one of the interesting things, there are a lot of interesting things in his dissertation, but one that stuck with me was that he found that the larger the organization, the less likely teams were to share the results of their postmortem outside of their team. The irony is the bigger your organization, the more necessary it is to share the results of your post-incident reviews outside of your team. And it's twofold. One is because our systems are very interdependent, so it's necessary, the chances are there's other teams that will care about what you learned, but also that act of storytelling helps us process it as an organization. And I like to say write-only postmortems don't help anyone. Right? So it's great, you got your postmortem form, you fill it out after an incident, it gets shoved off into Google Drive and nobody ever looks at it again. That didn't help anybody. You need to think about it as storytelling. This is how we process things, is by telling stories. So in top-down therapy, which is traditional talk therapy, it starts with the emotions. Why do you feel the way that you do? This is very similar to when we get very obsessed with looking for root cause initially. So the first thing, how many people are familiar with the theory that root cause is not a very good phrase? Okay, I'm going to introduce to all of you. I want everybody to learn a new term today. Instead of root cause, we use the term contributing factors. The reason is there is no root cause. I'm sorry, there is one root cause. You want to know what the true root cause is? The Big Bang, right? Our systems are complex, so we want to think about contributing factors. So the thing is, as well, but if we start looking for root cause while we're resolving an incident, there's two things that are going to happen. Is number one, during an incident, the only thing that matters is restoring service. Anything that's outside of restoring service is wasted time. So we shouldn't be doing that. The other thing is, by thinking root cause, the first contributing factor we find, we're going to jump on it, and we're like, aha, got it. There is my smoking gun. So we want to think about contributing factors. We want to collect them while we're dealing with the incident, but we're not looking for the root cause first. And this is why in somatic experiencing, we talk about working with the body before the emotions, and it's the same thing. We want to think about the physiological activity of incident response. I'm going to talk really quickly about something called cognitive distortions. They're exactly what they imply. They're distortions in our cognition, perspectives with bias, irrational thoughts and beliefs that we unknowingly reinforce over time. So there's as many as 16 generally accepted cognitive distortions. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm just going to touch on a few that might be causing issues in your organization. These are some that when I learned about them, like my history with IT, I've seen a lot of IT organizations doing this stuff. So one is called polarized thinking. This is also known as all or nothing thinking. This is seeing everything in extremes, either perfection or total failure. Remember, our systems are always in some state of failure. We don't have perfection, right? There's only so many nines that make sense. Then, overgeneralization is where we take a single instance and we generalize it to an overall pattern. So on a personal level, this would be something like, oh, I got a C on this test, I'm stupid and a failure. In an organization, it can be, we had a SEV1 incident on this particular service, so it's very unstable. This is making overgeneralizations, right? Fortune telling, boy, do we love to do this in IT, right? This is one that is very prevalent. We feel like if we have enough data that will be predictive. Machine learning, anybody? So if we only know enough, we could predict the future. Yes, we can start to get ideas on what is likely to happen, but guess what? Our systems are complex, our users are complex, our organizations are complex. We have to understand that our predictions are not fact, but just one of several positive outcomes. How many people have watched the Avengers movies, right? So you remember there was a whole thing with Doctor Strange, you saw like 1.5 billion different possibilities, so there's the one that's most likely, right? Control fallacies. This manifests in one of two beliefs, either that we have no control over our lives and we're helpless victims of fate, or that we have complete control over everything, which gives us responsibility for the feelings of those around us. Both of them are damaging and they're equally inaccurate. No one's in complete control over everything, and no one is completely out of control. Now, where this comes in technology, again, coming back from kind of my background in ops, we believe either A, that if only we had enough control, we could fix everything. If I could control what those damn developers did, everything would be great. Or practitioners often feel like they have no control because they're being dictated to, right? You always have some kind of impact, right? And if nothing else, you have the ability to respond mentally to how you affect. And what does this mean, right? Being resilient means that we don't see things from the perspective of things that happen to us. It's a matter of what we can do going forward. A culture of blame creates a culture of helplessness. So in our organizations, these are not about things that happen to us. Incidents happen, but it's what can we do going forward. Thank you very much.